You were never meant to hear this. What you are about to uncover was never supposed to surface. And yet, here it is, not in the pages of a novel or buried deep in a fictional horror script, but in the sealed archives of the Catholic Diocese of Wisconsin. For over 160 years, a truth has clawed beneath the floorboards of St. Mary's Convent, a truth that speaks not of miracles, but of shadows, of silence, of women who walked into holy walls and were never seen again. Between 1854 and 1862, 23 nuns vanished, not lost, not relocated, not reassigned. Vanished, no funerals, no farewells, no records. Just sudden absences, smoothed over with bureaucratic precision. The official church response, clerical error. The hidden documents say otherwise. And once you know, you'll never see sanctity the same way again. It begins with fog, not just over Lake Michigan, but fog in the minds of men who believed holiness could not coexist with corruption. The Catholic Church, in the mid-19th century, was expanding aggressively across America's Protestant frontier. St. Mary's was its flagship in Wisconsin, a repurposed estate wrapped in Gothic stone and isolation. Perfect for prayer, perfect for control. From the moment Bishop William Quarter's carriage passed through its iron gates, something dark began to breathe within those limestone walls. At first, it was subtle, a glance held too long, a silence that stretched just a beat too far. Whispers in Irish, hushed in Latin. But by the end of the first winter, the young women inside the convent began to change. Something ancient, something disciplined, something hidden, had taken root. Mother Catherine, the name alone held weight. Her eyes, pale as moonlight on graveyard snow, could strip lies from the lips of priests. She was not just a leader, she was doctrine incarnate, every movement precise, every rule sharpened like a blade. In the chapel, her voice was sacred. In the dormitories, it was law. She came from Boston, cloaked in reputation, selected for her ability to transform difficult communities. But in reality, she was chosen for something darker, her unwavering loyalty to a power far older than the Vatican. It was under her gaze that the rules began to shift. Penances turned into punishments, devotion turned into fear, and discipline became ritual. The first to vanish was Sister Agnes O'Connor. Just 23, pale freckles, soft hands, a girl raised in green Irish fields who dreamed of saints and salvation. One night she knelt beside her bed, whispering her rosary, and the next morning she was gone. No goodbye. No trunk. Not even a cloak for the spring chill. Mother Catherine said she'd been called to a mission in Minnesota. But the Minnesota mission never heard of her. And the letter her parents received months later was cold, formal, and undeniably forged. Her friends whispered of shadows in the hallway that night, a cry muffled behind stone. But fear seals lips, and silence became doctrine. Weeks later, Sister Bernadette disappeared, then Sister Josephine. Always the young ones, always the soft-spoken, the kind-eyed, the easily led. They vanished like smoke through keyholes, and in their place, more rules, more control, more night masses whispered in dead languages. By 1856, the orphanage's population had shrunk. The infirmary was quiet, but the chapel was full, at strange hours, with no witnesses, with candles that burned down to ash in corners not touched by sunlight. And those who remained inside St. Mary's, they moved like shadows, timid, hollow-eyed, bound not by love of God, but by fear of something else entirely. The outside world never questioned. Why would they? From the outside, St. Mary's was a success. Children were cared for. The sick were healed. The convent sent out weekly letters of charity and modesty. Donations arrived from Protestant and Catholic alike. But no one saw the truth sealed in the garden soil. No one noticed how the medicinal herb beds grew behind a fence no one entered, but Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret, a healer whose tinctures soothed the sick, but whose fingers were said to be stained. With more than just herbs, rumors swirled. A nun who bled from the eyes. A novice who walked backwards in sleep, whispering in a voice not her own. A buried statue, unearthed near the garden's edge, its face disfigured, its eyes gouged, but they were just stories, until a wall broke open. In 1998, during routine renovations, a sealed cavity behind the infirmary revealed a cache of letters, dozens, written in cramped, desperate hands. Pages smeared with ink, with blood, with something darker. They spoke of rituals, of hunger, of midnight processions and cold stone chambers hidden beneath the West Wing, of women forced to kneel in salt circles, chanting names not found in Scripture. And over again, they named her, Catherine, the mother, the one who opened the gate. Some called it hysteria. Some called it blasphemy. But one letter changed everything. It was signed by Sister Mary Collins, dated just 2 days before her disappearance in 1858. She wrote, "We are not brides of Christ. We are offerings. I have seen them take Sister Anne. They did not walk her out. They pulled her through the floor." The letter ends abruptly, torn, as if snatched from her hand. Now ask yourself, how far would an institution go to protect a secret like that? How deep does the rot run when holiness becomes a mask? If you are still here, still watching, then you are beginning to see. The surface is only pretense. What lies beneath is the true structure. Power, control, obedience, and the price of silence. I need you to comment 2 words below. Obedience breaks. Write it twice, lock it in. Not just for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you began to awaken. We are only at the threshold, and beyond this door lies the reason 23 women never came home. Section 2 will reveal why their disappearances were not isolated tragedies, but part of a system, a ritual, a hunger that still echoes through stone walls and dark catacombs. There is a moment, always, just before descent, where the world still feels familiar, where the sun still shines through stained glass and the hymns echo sweetly in vaulted halls. But once you step through the veil, once your feet touch stone never meant to be walked by light, everything shifts. What you thought was truth collapses, and what you once feared becomes something you now understand. A map, a pattern, a system etched in blood and sanctified in Latin. St. Mary's wasn't a sanctuary, it was a gate. And the missing nuns? They weren't lost. They were chosen. To understand the full scale of what happened inside the convent, we must confront a disturbing truth. These disappearances were not accidents. They were not miscommunications or distant reassignments lost in the fog of 19th century bureaucracy. They were offerings coordinated and intentional, part of an unspoken covenant, hidden beneath centuries of dogma. A covenant rooted not in the teachings of Christ, but in something older. Something pre-Roman, pre-Catholic, something dug up from the bones of Europe and smuggled across the Atlantic in the minds of a secret order. Let me take you to the year 1857. 4 sisters had already vanished, each under the same veil of convenience, transferred, called to service, requested by the bishop. But letters sent to these destinations came back unopened. Families wrote with increasing desperation, mothers asking if their daughters were well, brothers offering to send blankets or books. But the replies when they came were mechanical, cold, dehumanized, the kind of responses you receive from institutions, not sisters. Worse still, the signatures on these letters, when compared years later, matched not the missing women's handwriting, but that of a single, unidentified author, and yet no investigations followed. Why? Because the church governs its own. In 1850s America, the word of a bishop was gospel. The lives of nuns were cloistered, protected, and above all, disposable. In fact, within internal diocesan memos, leaked decades later by an anonymous clerical whistleblower, the vanishing of the St. Mary's nuns was referred to as interior reallocation, a phrase that chills the blood if you understand. The language of control. It means, we moved them. Don't ask where. But not everyone obeyed. Sister Teresa Donovan was unlike the others. Raised on a farm outside Galway, she'd spent her childhood herding cattle, climbing hills, and splitting firewood beside her father. Strong in body and mind, she was one of the few who dared ask questions. She noticed early that the disappearances always followed a pattern. First, the young woman would be given extra attention by Mother Catherine or Sister Elizabeth, singled out for praise, or encouraged to take night duties. Then she'd be seen entering the garden at twilight, often escorted. And then, she'd be gone. Teresa began to keep a journal. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, beneath her cot, she documented every vanishing. She drew crude maps of the convent's layout. Not the visible floors, but the lower ones, the hidden ones. The cold, echoing spaces where no one was allowed to go. Where candles burned even at midday, and where Sister Margaret kept her strongest. Tinctures locked behind iron, Teresa saw the doors. She heard the whispers through the vents at night, low, rhythmic voices, not quite Latin, not quite any human language. She wasn't alone. Sister Mary Collins had noticed it too. They began to meet in secret, under the guise of harvesting herbs or organizing linens. Their plan wasn't just to survive, it was to expose. And in those stolen moments, they discovered something no one outside the convent had ever heard. Beneath St. Mary's was a sealed chamber, locked not just by doors, but by doctrine. Known only to the Mother Superior, Sister Margaret, and two other women whose names never appeared in official records. These women were referred to only as the chambermaids of silence. And it was they who prepared the rituals. See, Mother Catherine's power wasn't just religious. It was esoteric. She practiced something that predates Christian theology. Something whispered about in Gnostic texts and burned out of public record during the Inquisition. It was a fusion of ascetic pain, feminine energy, and sacrificial obedience. In her doctrine, pain purified, silence revealed, and disappearance? That was ascension. To an outsider, this may sound absurd, fantastical. But consider this. Among the documents found in the hidden infirmary cavity in 1998 were several pages written in a blend of Latin and Ogham, the ancient Celtic script used by early Druidic cults. The symbol repeated most often? A crescent moon pierced by a cross, a bastardization of Catholic iconography indicating dual worship, the Virgin Mary. And something else, a female presence that demanded offerings. Not symbolic ones. Flesh. It's easy to dismiss this as conspiracy. But why then did so many who investigated the disappearances, even decades later, meet mysterious ends? Father Charles Dempsey, who reopened the case in 1931, was found dead in his study. Official cause, heart failure. But the expression on his face, captured in a photograph now buried in diocesan archives, was one of sheer terror. His last journal entry reads simply, "They're still here, beneath." Let's pause here. Let this sink in. These weren't just lost women. These were daughters, sisters, young girls filled with devotion and fear, swallowed by an institution built to protect them. Their obedience became their noose, their vows their grave markers. And no one came to help because they trusted the system. This is how psychological control works, not through chains or violence, but through belief. You make them believe they are chosen, that their suffering is sacred, that obedience is the highest form of love. And then, when they disappear, no one questions. Because obedience is also silenced. By 1858, only 13 nuns remained. And every one of them moved like a shadow, eyes low, voices soft. Teresa watched them change. Sisters who once laughed while baking bread now flinched at the sound of footsteps. Others stopped speaking entirely. Mother Catherine called it divine discipline, but Teresa knew better. It was terror. And terror is the oldest language of control. Then came the night of fire. It was September 3rd, 1858. The orphanage wing caught fire. Official records say it was a cooking accident. But Teresa's final journal entry tells a different story. She wrote of a scream, not of pain, but of defiance. Sister Margaret had tried to stop the ritual. She'd walked into the chamber that night with a bottle of lye, intending to destroy the altar, to end the rites, but she was caught. By whom? The journal never names them. Just says she was devoured by the order she once served. The fire was not an accident. It was a purge, a reset, and in the smoke and confusion, 3 more nuns vanished. No bodies were recovered. No graves were dug. Just more letters, more lies. After the fire, Bishop Quarter visited the convent. He stayed for precisely 6 hours. His carriage was seen leaving at dusk. The next day, every surviving nun was reassigned to other locations, scattered across distant dioceses, silenced. Separated, St. Mary's was deconsecrated. Left to rot, the land was sold and resold. But no one would live there long. Complaints of voices in the walls, of cold spots, of footsteps on stone when no one was there. One contractor in the 1920s reportedly refused to finish repairs, saying, "There's something alive in the bricks, something waiting." And still, no public investigation, because to investigate would be to acknowledge, and to acknowledge would be to unravel centuries of power. And make no mistake, this is about power. Not God, not faith, power, the kind that feeds on silence, on obedience, on fear passed from generation to generation, like a sacred heirloom. So why bring this to light now? Because the walls are bleeding again. In 2017, a group of urban explorers entered the abandoned convent. What they found has never been made public, but leaked police photos show crude symbols etched into stone. Candles burned down to nothing. And in the center of the chapel floor, a pile of nuns' habits. Old, moth-eaten, still folded. This is not over. And if you're still with me, it means you're starting to feel it too. That sense that the world is not as it seems. That beneath every institution is a root system of manipulation. That some truths were hidden not for your protection, but to protect those who feed on your ignorance. We have 6 sections left. And each one cuts deeper. Keep your eyes open. The Convent of Horrors has only just begun. She was only 17 when they gave her the veil, a girl with no family, no dowry, and nowhere else to go. They said she was lucky to be taken in. They called her Sister Therese of the Sacred Silence, but she was never silent. Not in her dreams, not when the nights were long and the whispers in the walls wouldn't let her sleep. Even before she spoke the unspeakable words, before the chapel caught fire and the Mother Superior vanished, they all knew something was wrong with her. They just didn't know how deep it went. Sister Therese came to St. Dymphna with eyes like melted coal dark, heavy and oddly wet, like something ancient was crying through her. She never smiled. She never cried. She simply watched. The others avoided her, even the priests. She spent her time in the catacombs when she thought no one noticed. But the walls remembered, even if the sisters did not. She read the old texts, banned ones, Latin so twisted that it stained the air. She found them tucked behind the altar, wrapped in decaying lambskin and sealed with wax shaped like a serpent's tongue. No one admitted who placed them there. But someone did. The convent had rules, and she broke all of them. She fasted for weeks until her lips split. She slept on stone floors instead of her straw mat. She wore thorns beneath her robe and smiled as they pierced. But this wasn't piety. It was preparation. When the sisters caught her whispering to The shadows in the sacristy, they thought it was madness. When she began drawing sigils with blood on the back of her hymnals, they called for a bishop. But by then, it was already too late. It was Sister Genevieve who saw the first sign. One morning, Teresa's cell was drenched in feathers black, oily ones like from a crow, but no crows were ever allowed within the convent walls. They barred her door, sealed it with prayer, and ordered her to kneel in fasting. But at night, they heard her speaking in tongues no one recognized, not even the bishop's scribe. Her voice would shift mid-sentence, first a girl's, then a woman's, then something older, inhuman, something that laughed with no joy. One night, the bell rang 3 times, though no one pulled its rope. The sky above the convent turned the color of dry blood, and all the candles inside the church lit themselves. The bishop fainted. Mother Agnes went blind. And when they opened Teresa's cell, it was empty. No signs of a struggle, no broken lock. Just the faint outline of a body burned into the stone floor like a reverse shadow, and a single word scrawled on the wall in thick, wet rust. Fiat, let it be done. 3 days later, she returned. She came to morning prayer as if nothing had happened. Pale, barefoot, and humming a melody that none of the sisters recognized, but all of them feared. She kissed Mother Agnes on the forehead. Her vision returned that same hour. She laid her hand on the bishop's shoulder. He never walked again. He called it a miracle, but the nuns knew better. Some say she died and came back. Others say she was taken and replaced. But all agreed, the girl who called herself Therese was no longer fully human. She began the ritual of the Crimson Vow not long after. She said it was an offering. Said it was meant to purify the flesh and raise the soul. But the soul of what? That was never clear. Each moonless night she would choose one sister to follow her into the catacombs. Always young, always new to the order, always lonely. They would go down holding candles, never to return the same. The girls who came back were silent for days, eyes wide, hands trembling. They never spoke of what they saw. One tried. Her tongue turned black within the hour. She died choking on flies. The whispers grew louder in those days. Floors creaked when no one walked them. Statues wept water that tasted like iron. The well dried up. The sky above the convent stayed permanently overcast. The crucifixes began turning upside down without warning, and no one could explain it. Even the local dogs stopped barking in the direction of the convent walls. The bishop, in his final act before he disappeared entirely, sent a letter to Rome. He called it a situation of theological anomaly. Rome never responded, but the ritual of the Crimson Vow reached its peak on the night of the Black Feast. It was a holy day. The chapel was filled with incense, and hymns rang from every wall. But behind the altar, hidden by a curtain, Therese was preparing something else. She had prepared a circle drawn in bone dust and ash. In its center, she placed a lamb's heart, still beating. How it was beating, no one could explain. She wore red that night. A robe stitched from veils of dead nuns, soaked in wine and something thicker. She chanted for hours. Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and then a language no human throat should shape. And when midnight came, she stood alone in that circle and screamed one word into the silence. Sponsa. Bride. The earth shook beneath the convent. Stones cracked. Candles exploded. One nun later claimed to see a figure rise from the floor beneath Therese's tall, dark, crowned in antlers and smoke. Another said it kissed her on the forehead, and when it did, her eyes glowed like coals. Whatever it was, it took her hand. And she went willingly. The ritual ended in silence. Her body never found. Her name never spoken again. But the ritual left a scar. From that day forward, every generation of sisters spoke of her in hushed tones. Some claimed to see her shadow walking the halls at night. Others found red footprints leading toward the old catacombs. Her name was scratched out of the registry, her portrait burned. but her presence never left. And every so often, a young nun would vanish, only to return 3 days later with blank eyes and a smile that didn't fit her face. The crimson vow, they say, was never undone. It still lives beneath the stone, pulsing like a buried heart. Waiting, hungry. They say that if you go to the convent on the anniversary of the Black Feast, you'll hear Teresa's chant echo from beneath the floor. Some believe she never died, that she waits in the shadows for the next bride to take her place, that the vow passes from woman to woman like a virus of the soul. And there's one more thing, one detail buried in an old journal hidden in the chapel wall. It says that Therese was not orphaned by accident, that her bloodline was ancient, tied to the pre-Christian cults of Gaul, that her real name wasn't Therese at all, but Taranissel, daughter of a line sworn to the god beneath the earth, that she was placed in the convent not to be saved, but to awaken something older than the church, older than Rome, older than even language. A power forgotten, but not gone. If that's true, then what happened that night wasn't possession. It was a wedding, and Therese wasn't a victim. She was the bride. And the convent, every stone, every prayer, every vow spoken in desperation, wasn't meant to protect the world from evil. It was meant to seal it in. But the seal cracked. And the vow was taken, and the blood keeps flowing. In the Convent of St. Dymphna, silence was a requirement, a sacred oath, a vow sealed not with ink, but with fear. The kind of silence that didn't just muffle voices, it hollowed out identities. It wasn't the peaceful hush of devotion. It was the choking stillness of secrets buried too deep to scream. And in that silence, something ancient began to speak. The walls themselves, built of crumbling limestone and stained with centuries of incense, ash and blood, seemed to pulse with memory. You could run your hand along their surface and feel, beneath the grain, a tremor, not from time or erosion, but from something that still breathed within. Visitors claimed they heard nothing unusual. But the girls who lived there, the orphans, the novitiates, the discarded, they learned early on that silence had layers. Beneath the quiet prayers, beneath the shuffle of robes and cold meals, there were faint clicks, like teeth on stone. There were sighs too low to name, but too close to ignore. The kind of sounds that no living nun would ever claim as her own. At first, the initiates thought it was stress, the mind rebelling against monotony. But then things began to vanish. Not items, those could be blamed on forgetfulness, but moments. A whole morning would pass, and none of the girls would remember breakfast. Hours evaporated like steam from their bowls of broth. A girl might begin a sentence and then stop mid-word, her eyes going blank as if something had walked across her thoughts. They began to whisper among themselves in the few chances they had to speak during washing chores or kneeling in mass, passing glances like smuggled relics. Something was wrong, but to say so was to be marked. And in St. Dymphna's, the marked didn't last long. It was Sister Honora, the eldest among the cloistered ones, who first broke the vow. She wasn't supposed to talk. Not outside confession. But one dusk, as the candles flickered and the corridors stretched like mazes wrapped in shadow, she leaned close to a young girl named Clara and whispered, "The walls remember what we forget." Her voice was brittle, like dry leaves rubbed together. Her breath smelled of cloves and something sour, like rot beneath a floorboard. "Don't stare too long at the stones. They'll show you things, but they take something in return." Clara didn't understand, not yet. But in the weeks that followed, she began to see the patterns. How Sister Meredith always turned the same corner 5 times before entering the chapel. How no nun ever walked barefoot after sunset. How the crucifixes weren't just decoration, they were thresholds. And worse still, how the confessional booth was never used for confession. Instead, at night, certain sisters would enter and whisper to it, not in Latin, not in English, in some low, slithering tongue that sounded like weeping backwards. Walls weren't stone anymore. Not really. They were skin, stretched thin over something else. You could feel it when you leaned too close, heat, like breath. And if you pressed your ear, you could hear what the silence truly said, "Help me, or join me." That's when the scratching began. It came from behind the altar first, then from beneath the dormitory floorboards. At first, it was subtle, like mice, but then it grew stronger. Deeper, it sounded like fingernails clawing through old wood, or worse, bone. Sister Honora claimed it was the penitent trying to escape. When asked what that meant, she only smiled a toothless smile and pointed at the crucifix. "He isn't the only one nailed in." Then came the bleeding walls. It wasn't dramatic. No river. No flood. Just slow, rhythmic droplets, seeping from the seams of the stone. The clergy claimed it was condensation, mold, or rust from old nails deep within the masonry. But those who tasted it knew better. It was iron-rich. Too warm. It was blood. One night, Clara followed Sister Meredith after prayers. The elder nun moved swiftly for her age, gliding almost, her feet barely making contact with the worn stones. She disappeared behind the library wall, except the library had no door. Just shelves and dust and ancient hymnals too fragile to touch. Clara waited. Then the wall shifted. A brick moved. Not pushed. It slid of its own accord. A passage revealed itself, yawning like a mouth that hadn't spoken in centuries. Clara entered, compelled by a force that wasn't curiosity, but compulsion. What she saw beneath the convent changed her forever. The tunnel sloped downward, lit by candles that hadn't been lit by human hands. Their flames burned blue. The air was thick, not with dust, but with presence. Not quite a smell, but a sensation. Like walking into a room where someone had just died. The corridor ended in a round chamber, stone, circular, but not built by modern tools. It felt older than the convent itself, older than memory. In the center was a pit. Inside, something stirred, not visibly, but in the mind. Looking at it was like staring into a memory you didn't have. Around the pit were symbols carved in languages that hurt to look at, letters that seemed to shift every time you blinked. And around the walls of the chamber, nuns stood, silent, staring, not praying, feeding, but not with food. Each had her eyes closed, lips murmuring. And in the air above the pit, the shadows twisted. Shapes formed, faces, children, men, women, screaming silently, trapped mid-expression. As if the walls had swallowed whole moments of lives and now replayed them like phantoms caught in a loop. Clara ran, or tried, but the walls did not allow exit so easily. They shifted, reformed. Her path became a spiral, the floor undulating beneath her like the belly of a great, sleeping thing. She screamed, but no voice came, only silence. And from the walls, laughter, low, feminine, cruel, when she finally escaped. When the stone finally relented and she burst back into the candlelit dormitory, she was changed. Her hair had grayed at the roots. Her fingernails were blackened. Her eyes twitched even in rest. And worse, she could no longer speak. Not because of trauma, but because something had taken her tongue. Not physically, not with knives, but something in that chamber had unraveled her ability to form words. From that day forward, she only scribbled, in spirals, in glyphs that matched the ones beneath the earth. The Mother Superior declared her mad, sent her to the infirmary. But Sister Honora visited her every night. And one night, she whispered to Clara's unblinking stare, "They know you now. You looked into the memory of the convent." And it looked back. For years after, the girls began waking with marks. Not bruises, not scratches, but symbols tiny. Thin, almost invisible sigils etched into their skin like brands. They itched, burned in moonlight. And worst of all, They matched the same spiral language Clara now scrawled in her sleep. The silence of the convent had turned into a language of its own, a script of shadows, of trauma, of spiritual erosion. A dialect built not on words, but on absences, where every missing hour, every forgotten scream, every unspoken prayer fed the thing beneath the stone, and still, the outside world praised the convent. Still, pilgrims came. Still, children were left on the stone steps, and the walls waited. Because silence in the Convent of St. Dymphna was never peace. It was a pact, one that demanded payment, one that hungered for memories, for identity, for language itself. And in return, it gave only one gift: oblivion, the kind you can't recover from, the kind that devours you softly, the kind that leaves your mouth moving long after your soul is gone. At first, it was only whispers. Not voices, exactly, but echoes. Echoes that came from nowhere and returned to nowhere. The sisters described them as fragments of broken hymns, heard in places where no song should live, the root-choked corners of the cellar, the small space between the walls, the icy crevice behind the altar. Sometimes they spoke Latin, sometimes older dialects, and sometimes something else. A twisting tongue, bone-sharp and breathless, that made the skin prickle and the blood stir. Sister Eliza was the first to say it out loud. It isn't us whispering. It never was. She had changed by then. The girl who once sang quietly during evening prayers now tore out pages of the Psalms and scribbled symbols onto the walls of her cell. She didn't sleep. She stared too long into shadows, especially the ones that moved when nothing else did. On the third night of her descent, she bit clean through the skin between her thumb and index finger, and used the blood to trace circles on the stone floor, circles with teeth, spirals like eyes rolling backward into a skull. When Mother Adeline found her, Eliza was already mumbling. Not gibberish, not madness, but a structured cadence, a rhythm too deliberate to be random and far too ancient to be human. They said she was possessed, but they didn't say by what. The priest they brought in was old and practical. His name was Father Lucian, and he came with a small leather satchel filled with relics, holy water, and books that smelled of mildew and forgotten oaths. The moment he stepped into Eliza's cell, he froze. The air was colder than death, and the candles refused to stay lit. Eliza didn't look at him. She looked through him. Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the same gloss found in drowned things. Then she spoke a word, just one, and Father Lucian collapsed. He did not faint, he did not seize. He simply crumpled like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The sisters screamed, but Eliza just laughed, a short, hiccuping laugh like a child testing its voice for the first time. They say her lips didn't move when she did it. Later, when the priest awoke in the infirmary, he couldn't remember his own name, but he could recite a 7-verse chant in a language no one had heard before, and no one ever wished to hear again. After that, silence was forbidden. No sister was allowed to pray alone, to eat alone, or to sleep without a second nun present. Darkness enters through stillness, Mother Adeline declared. So we will fill every room with noise, with light, with breath. But darkness always finds a way in. Even through cracks sealed with hope. More sisters began to change. Sister Bridget started writing backward pages of script that, when read in a mirror, described maps. Not maps of countries or towns, but diagrams of the bones of something large. The bones formed cathedrals, and the cathedrals bled. Sister Mercy began waking with dirt in her mouth and twigs tangled in her habit, though her door was always locked. Sister Annalise confessed in trembling whispers that she could see faces in the marble of the baptismal font. Not holy faces, open-mouthed and blind-eyed, watching her even when she blinked. And then came the dreams. It began with one nunna, novice barely 16, who screamed herself hoarse during the night. She described being pulled through soil by arms made of stone. dragged into a cathedral buried under centuries of silence, where figures in robes sat in pews made of ribs. A congregation of things that hummed and watched. In the center was a pulpit and something speaking from it, not with words, with thoughts. That screamed. She said it showed her a version of the convent long after all the sisters were gone. The walls melted, the altar inverted, the cross replaced by a writhing mass of roots that fed on prayers. She slit her wrists the next morning with a shard of broken rosary. The other sisters began to suffer the same visions. Some saw the future. Others saw the past. None saw anything that brought comfort. But all of them heard the voice. It didn't speak from outside. It lived inside now. The voice did not ask for obedience. It expected it, and when disobeyed, it punished in silence. One by one, the nuns began to display the same symptoms: night tremors, stigmata-like bruises, seizures that twisted their joints. Backward, they tried penance, fasting, self-flagellation. But the voice remained. It laughed when they bled. It rejoiced when they cried. And sometimes, just sometimes, it whispered names. Not theirs, yours, mine, names of people it should never have known. It was Sister Agatha who discovered the origin, or part of it. She had been digging through the convent's library, chasing a trail of letters that didn't belong to any known liturgy. What she found was a small black-bound book hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. It had no title, but it hummed faintly when she touched it, as if it had a pulse. Inside were accounts of rituals that predated Christianity, of rites performed beneath the bone moon, of blood offered to the mouth beneath. Agatha spent the next 2 nights reading it cover to cover. On the third morning, she was gone. Only a single phrase remained, scratched into the stone of her floor using her own fingernails. It has always lived here. We just gave it a name. That phrase spread like a contagion. The sisters began to repeat it without knowing, in their sleep, in their meals, during prayer. It embedded itself in the very rhythm of their breath, like a lullaby hummed too often. Then came the tongues. No longer whispers, no longer dreams, but full voices, clear and cutting, rising from the floorboards, leaking from the crucifix, speaking from behind the stained glass. They called each sister by name. They offered secrets in exchange for silence. They described rooms that had never been built, but had always existed beneath the stone. Some sisters followed the voices, down into the crypts, beyond the ossuary, into the forgotten tunnels once used for plague victims. They didn't come back. At least not all of them. Of the ones who did return, none were whole. They walked wrong, their backs hunched too low. Their eyes didn't blink in sync. Their voices were almost right, but not quite. They sang in harmony that wasn't harmonic. They moved in patterns that suggested they were mimicking being human, rather than actually being human. And when asked where they had gone, they said the same thing: we met the thing that breathes under God's shadow. Eventually, the convent sealed the lower levels, iron bars, salted thresholds, holy oil, but it was too late. The infestation was spiritual, not physical. The entity or entities had already tasted faith and found it delicious. It no longer needed doors. It spoke through sacred texts, rearranging letters into heresies. It sang through hymns, inverting the melodies. It stared through statues, blinking when no one watched. And so the sisters broke. Some flung themselves into wells. Others scratched at their faces until they were unrecognizable. One sewed her mouth shut to silence the voice, only for it to begin echoing out of her chest. Mother Adeline remained calm. She insisted it was a trial, a divine test, that if they simply endured, they would be saved. But no salvation came. Instead, one night during Vespers, the chapel lights extinguished. On their own, the bells rang backwards. And something answered, not with wrath, with welcome, like a long-lost thing returning home. When the candles flickered back to life, The cross behind the altar was upside down, and standing beneath it was Sister Eliza, who had been dead for weeks. She spoke one word, the same word that silenced Father Lucian. Only this time the walls bled, and the ground began to breathe. The year the convent gates were sealed shut for the final time. Not a single bell rang. There were no announcements, no excommunications, no funerals. Just a silence thicker than the fog that clung to the woods around St. Dymphna's. Official records show that the convent ceased operations in the winter of 1894, but the townsfolk, those who had once glanced nervously at the black-clad silhouettes wandering the chapel courtyard, say it died long before that. Or worse, that something inside it finally woke up and demanded everything. 16 nuns lived in the convent during its final year. After the church quietly closed the site, only 4 ever left its grounds. The other 12? They vanished without trace. No burial, no transfer, no letters to family, nothing. It was as if they had been absorbed into the bones of the building itself. But those who've studied what little remains from that eerie unburned ledgers, stained garments, discarded journal pages, believe something far darker happened behind the convent's thick walls. A priest named Father Marius, assigned to oversee the convent's closure, arrived weeks after contact with the sisters had ceased entirely. When he stepped inside the grand nave, he found it abandoned, candles burned to wax puddles, pews overturned, the statue of the Virgin Mary shattered and headless. The only human sign was a trail of bare, dirty footprints that led from the altar down into the catacombs. He never made it to the crypts. Something forced him back, something he could never describe directly in his notes, only alluded to in phrases like inversion of holiness, blood song in the stone, and their eyes no longer human. Father Marius left the convent and locked its doors with chains he had blessed himself. Then he begged Rome to forget it ever existed. They did, but the 4 nuns who survived told a different story. Sister Imelda was the youngest, only 19 when she took her vows. She had grown up in the village and entered the order out of love for the Virgin. She spoke only once after her departure, to a nurse in a sanitarium where she later died from starvation, refusing all food. Her final words, whispered in Latin, were transcribed by the attending nurse. "We are the candles." But the flame was never God's. The second survivor, Sister Hildegard, was found wandering the forest naked, covered in ash. She'd carved crude crosses into her chest and legs. When brought back to the village, she screamed in a dialect no one understood. Not Latin, not German, something older, something primal. She died that same night, biting off her own tongue. The third, Sister Apollonia, lived in silence for another 12 years in a monastery for the mentally broken. Her writings, recovered after her death, speak of a chamber below the convent deeper than the known catacombs, where a mother of shadows lay buried under 7 seals. But the seals were breaking, she wrote, one by one. Each broken seal bringing more voices, more visions, more power. She believed the sisters were being transformed, not possessed, reborn in the image of something ancient, feminine, and wrathful. But it's the final survivor that gave researchers the most disturbing insight. Sister Magdalene was the Mother Superior during the convent's last year. When she was found, she was not mad. She was not incoherent. She was lucid, eloquent, and terrifying. She claimed the rituals were not invented by the sisters. They were inherited, passed down from woman to woman, long before the Church ever arrived in the region, long before there were crosses or saints. She spoke of the Red Lineage, a blood-bound order of women who worshipped a goddess of silence and sacrifice. The convent, she said, had been built atop an ancient shrine to this entity, not to entomb it, but to feed it. Every prayer, every hymn, every chime of the chapel bell. It was part of the ritual. We fed her through obedience, Magdalene confessed to the bishop who interrogated her. And she grew. The bishop who interviewed her died weeks later of a sudden brain aneurysm, but not before he scrawled a final note in the margins of her transcript. She knew things no woman should know, no human. The church buried that report, but whispers persisted. Scholars from forbidden history circles and fringe religious cultists became obsessed with the case. They believed St. Dymphna's was not just a convent, but a living organism designed to incubate a kind of spiritual infection. The nuns, willingly or not, had become vessels. 12 stayed behind to serve the thing they had awakened. Or maybe they had never been there in the first place, only shadows, pretending at piety while slowly opening a door sealed by centuries of silence. Modern investigators who've attempted to enter the ruins speak of overwhelming dread, vomiting, and disorientation just standing near the gate. Some report hearing low chanting on windless days. Others see robed figures moving behind broken stained glass windows. But when the police are called, nothing is found. Just dust, rot, and the lingering scent of frankincense and copper. A few paranormal researchers believe the sisters never vanished. They ascended or descended into a different layer of reality. One theologian from Prague refers to them as the bride choir of the hollow womb. His theory? The rituals performed at the convent were meant to breach a boundary between the sacred and the profane, the divine and the monstrous, but the ritual went wrong. Or perhaps it went perfectly. Whatever force they summoned didn't leave. It nested. It fed. It waits. The villagers know better than to speak of it. Their ancestors passed down rules not written, but remembered. Never approach the chapel after sunset. Never walk alone near the boundary stones. And if you hear a woman singing from inside the trees, run. Today, the convent is off limits, officially deemed unsafe due to structural collapse. But locals still place offerings near the locked gate, rosaries, bread, wine, not to honor the church, but to keep the old hunger asleep, to pay tribute to the 12 sisters who became something else. And perhaps, just perhaps, to warn the 13th, because legends say the ritual was never meant to stop. It needs a 13th to begin again. And one day, a woman will hear the call in her dreams, feel the pull in her blood. She will find herself drawn to the place without knowing why. And when she opens the gate, everything buried will rise again. They never truly vanished. They simply waited. And the convent never closed its eyes. It was only sleeping and dreaming.